Welcome to this session on embedding literacy, numeracy, ICT and study skills in other subject learning. This programme is the result of collaboration between the City and Guilds Centre for Skills Development and the Centre for Education in the Criminal Justice System, part of the Institute of Education, University of London. These slides and audio narration on embedding learning are intended as a framework for your CPD session. So ideally, this presentation should be used to stimulate discussion with other teachers and with a nominated facilitator. The facilitator should aim to generate discussion and questions. The suggested activities for this embedded learning session are outlined on the activity sheet and can be fitted in as appropriate during the presentation. Other activities are suggested within the script as well. You could follow up on some or all of these suggestions depending on how much time you have available. To start with, let's see what ideas everyone has already about embedding learning. Please pair up and for 5 minutes discuss the questions on this slide. Come up with an answer, however brief, for each question. Make a note of anything you can't answer or about which you disagree. Researchers found that there are a number of reasons why embedding learning is an effective approach. Some major reasons are that learners feel more motivated. They find learning easier in a work or practical context. And learners feel more confident about their learning. Learners who would feel embarrassed about attending a course called literacy or help with spelling or improve your basic maths prefer to improve these skills as part of a vocational course, as this reduces their fear of stigma or embarrassment. How do you feel about these reasons for embedding learning? The main finding of research is that literacy, basic maths, basic ICT and study skills are the essential foundations for all learning and for effective activity in all walks of life. It is also clear that it is best not to teach these skills separately from the main vocational subjects such as engineering, biology or history, but integrated within those main subjects. Literacy, numeracy and ICT are known as the minimum core skills. All teachers in the learning and skills sector have a formal responsibility to support learners in these skills regardless of what subjects they teach. Again, compare the points made here with the ideas you all came up with at the beginning of the session. In this and the following slide, we look at the way the main subject and the minimum core subjects are linked through embedded learning. In pairs, try spending 2 minutes summarising the Venn diagram here in no more than 140 characters, like a message on Twitter. Here's a quote from a government guide to embedded learning. It highlights that embedded teaching and learning combines the development of literacy, language and numeracy with vocational and other skills. It also identifies that these skills provide learners with the confidence, competence and motivation to succeed in qualifications, in life and in work. What do you think are the most important points in this quotation? So far, we have looked at what embedded learning is and why it is important. Now we need to look at how to use embedded approaches to teaching and learning. There are 3 aspects to this which are closely related. 1. Embedding literacy and language, everyday maths and or ICT in teaching and learning of the main subject. 2. Developing your students' study skills. And 3. Using feedback to support embedded learning. You may want to discuss each of these and think back to the earlier sessions of this CPD programme for ways to put these ideas into practice. The next slide might complement some of your own advice. It is quite practical for you to teach your subject while at the same time embedding the minimum core within it. First of all, You do not have to be expert in literacy, numeracy or ICT to support students' embedded learning. Think about your main curriculum. What elements of the minimum core does it naturally contain? Another way of thinking about this is, what minimum core skills do your students need to learn their main curriculum effectively? Remember to build on your students' existing skills as far as possible. You could talk about each of these points with your colleagues. Do you agree that you don't have to be an expert? What elements of literacy, numeracy and ICT does your course contain? And what of these do your students already need and use? And what do you need to know in order to build on your students' existing skills? You can compare your answers to some suggestions on the next slide. Taking a programme on life and employability skills as an example, important minimum core skills might include confident and clear speaking and listening, functional reading, writing, maths and ICT, and study skills such as planning, organisation and timekeeping. These are all important elements of a life and employability skills programme, which are also part of the minimum core. What do you and your group think? Are there any questions about the values of embedding minimum core learning into a programme like this one, particularly for learners on community sentence or probation? There are different approaches you can take to plan how you will achieve embedded learning. Let's look at each of these in turn. You can identify specific minimum core skills and teach them directly, separately from your main subject teaching. For example, you might plan to spend a timed part of your lesson on using apostrophes correctly, such as how they can make its mean different things. You might start by showing your students what the difference is between ITS, IT apostrophe S, and ITS apostrophe. Explain the rule to them, and then give them a short list of sentences in which they have to choose the correct version of its. In this case, the teaching of a minimum core skill is discrete and separated from other parts of your overall programme. The second choice you have is to teach parts of the minimum core and your main subject at the same time. Discuss with your colleagues how this might be done. You can then work out a mini lesson plan together that follows this example. Thirdly, you can also support your students' minimum core learning by the way you give feedback on their main subject learning. The simplest way to do this is when you give feedback on a piece of writing. You can feedback not just on how well they have completed the task, but on their spelling, punctuation and grammar. This doesn't just mean pointing out the mistakes. It also means showing students how they might improve their work. For example, you might say, "There are 2 punctuation errors in this sentence. Can you see them? Can you have another go at writing them correctly?" and so on. You can use any or all of these approaches within the same lesson, of course. The next slide gives a list of classroom learning activities you can organise through which you can use the embedded approach. Pair up with a colleague and spend 5 minutes listing all the learning activities you can think of which could deliver embedded learning in your classes. Here we have a list of potential activities. How do your lists compare with this one? Now, in groups of 4, choose any one of these activities or one of the ones that you thought of and spend 5 minutes sketching out how you could use it for embedding learning. On this and the next slide, we look at starter activities. These are the activities you organise right at the beginning of the class. Starter activities are useful in a number of ways. They provide productive activity for the students who arrive early or on time. They help to start the lesson in a lively and motivating way. They can give a flavour of what is to come later in the lesson, and they can model productive learning behaviour right from the start. Before we look at some specific examples, can you think of and list any starter activities that involve embedding the minimum core. Here are 5 examples of starter activities that use the embedded approach. Can you see each one working in your classes? Have you got suggestions for improving them, or do you have other ideas? Discuss and share these with your colleagues, and if you have used starter activities in your class, tell everyone how they went. This and the next few slides deal with various ways of supporting the English language and literacy learning of your students. One major way to support the development of literacy and language learning is by ensuring that the feedback you give to students is effective and useful to them. You can feedback on their writing at 3 different levels, and you can keep these 3 levels of feedback separate. One level of feedback is to look at the writing as a whole piece, its overall meaning, and the kind of writing it is, technical, persuasive, descriptive, and so on. This is to give text-level feedback. Alternatively, you could focus on individual sentences, for which you would feedback on the grammar of the sentence, whether it made sense within itself, whether it started with a capital letter, had a main verb, and so on. This is sentence-level feedback. Or you could look at the writing word by word, for which you would feedback on their vocabulary and their spelling. This is word-level feedback. For each of these levels, you can also focus on the 3 main areas of literacy and language learning, which are writing, spelling, or speaking and listening. The key point for supporting literacy and language learning is to feedback separately on each element of text, sentence and words, and on each area of writing, spelling and speaking and listening. Perhaps on one occasion you only give feedback about the sentence level issues to do with writing, if that is what your student needs most. Another time you might focus on word level issues to do with reading. You can explain this system to your students, and this should make the feedback more helpful. Perhaps they will be more likely to act upon your feedback. Here we have a chart with 9 panels, 3 each for word level, sentence level and text level for each of the 3 areas. 1 or 2 entries have been made to get you started. Pause and spend up to 5 minutes to have a go at completing the chart and to discuss your suggestions. Here you find a list of 7 literacy topics. For the next part of the session, in groups or on your own, you should pick out one of these topics and focus on how you help your students improve this aspect of their English. Slide 19 looks at improving vocabulary. Slide 20 looks at spelling, Slide 21 looks at punctuation, and Slide 22 looks at grammar in sentence-level writing. When looking at each of these slides, consider what are the suggestions from your group and how do they compare with these ideas. What are the ideas that you'd like to use? The next 2 slides suggest ways of embedding maths and ICT in your lessons to support your students' everyday needs. Have a think about what your students' everyday maths and ICT needs are. You could pair up again to list 3 ways in which you can support your students' maths and ICT development. Here is a list of ways in which you can incorporate ICT into teaching and learning through classroom activities. How do they compare with your ideas? How might you use some of these suggestions in your classes? This and the next few slides focus on helping your students to improve their study skills. There are 4 main areas of study skills. These are reading and using written materials, producing written assignments, note-taking from classes or from writing, and folder or work organisation. What activities can you suggest to support your students to improve their study skills under these 4 headings? As a group task, you could join into a group of 4 and each cover one heading. Students can be supported in many ways to read and to use written materials. Some ideas listed here are, firstly, to help students think as widely as possible about what reading is and what it involves, perhaps by getting them to make posters. Secondly, it helps if you can encourage students to identify their own strengths and areas for development, with personal action plans to address these. And then, there are also potential areas of confusion to address as a group. For example, you could teach and review what the instructions to skim, scan, read closely, to summarise and to take notes actually entail. How do these compare with your suggestions for improving study skills? Here are some ideas and activities for helping students to produce written assignments. How do they compare with your ideas? Here are some ideas and activities for helping students to take notes. How do they compare with your ideas? Here are some ideas and activities for helping students to organise their work folders. How do they compare with your suggestions? This advice, which is all based on recent research, probably needs to be in your mind whenever you give written feedback. It's important for students to have selective feedback that they can address, so prioritise what we would like them to work on first, but don't highlight everything. You also must be specific, make precise points using examples. Think about the word, sentence and text levels of literacy development and address these. Use a marking code if appropriate. Finally, it is important that students see their strengths and see the point of acting on feedback. Highlight existing strengths and, to encourage improvements, highlight the links to future work. As a rounding up activity, you could discuss these key points briefly in small groups. Are there any questions or other issues people want to raise on study skills, giving effective feedback, and on embedding learning in general? Plan how to take forward work on embedding learning into your teaching practice. This may involve scheduling a further meeting or an agreement to try out certain ideas. Thank you for listening. We hope that this session has included some ideas that will be useful to you in your practice and in your professional development. For more information, please contact Jane Hurry at the Institute of Education, Centre for Education in the Criminal Justice System.